Now we need a new screen, the filters screen, and therefore in this screens folder, I'll add filters.dart, which, as you might guess, will hold my filters screen widget. And this actually must be a stateful widget here, because we'll need to manage some internal user input state in this widget, since we will present multiple switches to the user that can be used by the user to set various filters. So here we have the stateful widget, and of course, as always, we have the create state method here, and we also have filters screen as a constructor here, where I forward my key like this. And then I'll add the underscore filters screen state class, where I extend state for filters screen like that, like we did it before, and also use that here as a value for this generic type. And then here we add the build method. Now here in create state, we then return a new instance of our filters screen state class. And in the build method down here, we then return a scaffold, because this is a brand new screen and therefore it gets its own scaffold, so that we, for example, can set an app bar for that screen. But also so that we soon can add the drawer, because this screen will also need access to the drawer so that we can leave this screen. But I'll get back to this in a second. So here we have the app bar, and I'll add a title here on this app bar, which I'll set to a constant text widget, where I simply say your filters. This sounds like a fitting title. And then of course we also need a body here, so the main content of the filters screen. And here I'll go for a column because I want to display multiple filter switches in the end. Switches that will be shown below each other that can be used to turn these different filters on or off. So therefore here I add children, and now every switch will be a switch list tile, which is a convenience widget provided by Flutter that's optimized for being presented in a list, because this will then display one single row in that list, but in a list full of switches, where you can set a label for every switch, but you'll then also have that switch widget that can be tapped by the user to turn something on or off. So that's a very convenient widget for rendering, for example, setting lists, as we're doing it here in the end. And switch list tile wants a value, which is a boolean, so which is simply true or false, controlling whether the switch is currently turned on or off. And then an onChanged parameter that in the end wants a function that receives a boolean, which will be triggered whenever such a switch is pressed. Now I will add both in a second, but before I do that, I'll add some other parameters which I also want to set on a switch list tile. For example, the title. The title parameter can be used to add a label that will be shown next to the switch, and here I want to display some text with help of the text widget, and the text I do want to display here for my first switch is gluten-free, because this first switch will be about setting this filter. I then also want to apply some styling to this text here, and for this I'll use my theme, the text theme, and their title large, and again copy this with some extra settings which I'll change, and the setting I will change here will be the color, which I also take from my theme, but where I then want to use the on background color from my color scheme, like this. Now, in addition to setting this title, I'll also set a subtitle, which, as the name kind of suggests, is a parameter we can set on switch list tile to render some typically smaller text below the main title, the main label of the switch, so to say. And in this case, I'll use subtitle to render some extra explanation. And for my first switch here, where I toggle the gluten-free filter, I'll say only include gluten-free meals. This is simply some extra explanation which I want to add here, and I will also adjust the style of this text here, and hence I'll copy the style from my title. But here I don't want to use title large as a starting point, but instead label medium, which simply displays smaller text, but I'll also set the color to on background here. Thereafter, I'll also set the active color parameter, which allows us to control which color will be used for rendering this switch if it's activated, if it is turned on, so to say. And here I'll also use a color from my theme, and I'll use the tertiary color here. Last but not least, I'll set the content padding parameter to control how much padding will be used inside of this list tile in the end. And here I'll set this to edge insets only, to only target specific directions. And I'll set up padding to the left of 34 and to the right of 22. And of course, you can tweak and fine-tune these values as needed. So that's the base configuration for one row in my list of settings, which I will in the end have. And now, of course, we have to come back to the value and onChanged. Now, the value will be some state that I manage here, because of course the value should be changeable, and if it is changed, it should be reflected back on the user interface. So here I'll add a variable to the filters screen state, which I'll call _gluten-free filter set. And initially this could be false, so that initially the filter is not set, though soon we're going to load the data that has been set by the user in the past. But at the moment, I'll always initialize this to false. And then use this as a value down there. And then for onChanged, I'll add an anonymous function. We could also add a separate method to this state class, of course, but here I'll go for an anonymous function where I get the new value, or simply the answer to the question whether this is checked or not. This parameter name is up to you because it's your function, but it will always be a Boolean because this function will be called by Flutter for you, and Flutter will pass a Boolean value to that function if you want it or not. But now here I can use this isChecked information to update gluten-free filter set. And for that, of course, we have to call setState because the UI should reflect that change. And then I'll set gluten-free filter set equal to isChecked, so to this parameter value here. And with that, we should have a first list item.